she accused the Indiana Fever fan base of being racist. They investigated it. They said those accusations were false. The least that she could do is apologize to our great state and the fans that show up at these games and say, I'm sorry, I was wrong. Obviously, she's not going to do that. But also, Dan, why isn't the Indiana Fever apologizing to their own fan base for putting them through that, for going through those types of accusations? I mean, those are awful accusations. They weren't true. The fans weren't shouting racial slurs toward Angel Reese or opposing players. I mean, where is Caitlin Clark? Where is the Indiana Fever? Where is the WNBA saying that investigation there shouldn't have been an investigation? The allegations were false. Where's the apology? It hasn't happened. It's disappointing. As someone who is, my daughters are fans of the team. They've gone to games to see Caitlin Clark. It's so demeaning to our state and to the fan base to go through something like that. The least they can
deserve the right to play. Everyone deserves the right to come here, sit in these seats, and feel safe and not feel like there's a threat or they can't be who they are. Definitely will be speaking up against that legislation and those laws that are trying to be passed, for sure.
Caitlin Clark and the Indiana Fever are the best gift that the WNBA has ever had. I mean, and the fans that show up and pack that place, I mean, sell out crowds every time Caitlin Clark plays. It's so great for Indiana, but it's good for the WNBA. But how dare you accuse our fans, the Hoosiers that show up at these games, being racist when they're not? I mean, that was a opposing player who hates Caitlin Clark. Frankly, it's a great rivalry for the teams and for the sport. But don't accuse our fans of being racist. I mean, that's the kind of garbage that gets thrown around all the time. It wasn't true. The investigation proved it, and there was no outcome of it. There was no apology. Apologize to the fans. I mean, that's a simple thing to do, and I wish the team would have been more emphatic about that. Stand up, stick up for your fan base. I mean, that's who's keeping you alive. So maybe they'll still do that. I don't know. I mean, I tweeted that Angel Reese should apologize, and my tweet got a lot of reactions, but I'm not going to.
There's a moment in every institution's history when someone with real authority decides they've seen enough. That moment just happened in the WNBA, and it's exposing something the league probably hoped would stay buried. Governor Braun of Indiana didn't just make a casual comment about basketball. He publicly questioned the fundamental fairness of how the league operates. This isn't about politics invading sports. This is about a governor defending his state, his constituents, and what appears to be a pattern of selective justice within professional women's basketball. What started as a viral video and a controversial investigation has spiraled into something much bigger. We're talking about an entire system that seems designed to protect certain players while leaving others vulnerable to intense scrutiny. The Caitlin Clark effect has transformed Indiana basketball and given the WNBA unprecedented attention, but that success has also exposed deep cracks in how the league operates. The question isn't whether someone said something controversial anymore. The question is why the WNBA investigates some incidents with lightning speed while ignoring others caught on camera. Let's break down exactly what happened and what it means for the league's future. Let's start with what millions of people saw. There's a video that went viral, and in it, Brittney Griner appears to make a comment about Caitlin Clark. The moment it hit social media, people started interpreting what they heard, and interpretations varied wildly depending on who was watching. Some viewers swore they heard a racial slur paired with harsh criticism of Clark. Others insisted she was directing her comments at a referee's call, using sports language that's common on the court, but sounds different when taken out of context. Here's what matters about that video. It exists. It's on camera. Millions of people have seen it, and the reactions split almost immediately along predictable lines. Some defended Griner, saying the footage was being manipulated or misunderstood. Others said the comments were inexcusable and demanded consequences. But here's the fascinating part. The WNBA's response to this recorded moment was noticeably different from how it handled other controversies. When you capture something on video in professional sports, that's supposed to be the clearest possible evidence. It's not he said, she said. It's not allegations or rumors. It's documented reality. Yet despite having this video, the league didn't exactly rush to investigate or issue statements clarifying what Griner actually said. The silence was deafening, especially when you compare it to how quickly the WNBA moved on other matters. What's interesting is that Griner's supporters have offered an explanation. They argue she was criticizing a referee's call, using common sports vernacular that sounds worse in isolation than it actually is. That's a reasonable interpretation. But if that's truly what happened, why didn't Griner or the league simply come forward and explain it? Why not clarify the record immediately when there's video evidence available? The lack of response tells you something about how the league operates. In traditional sports reporting, when there's video footage of a player saying something controversial, the league typically investigates quickly, issues a statement, and moves forward. The player might face discipline or be cleared of wrongdoing, but the process is transparent. That didn't happen here. Instead, the WNBA seemed content to let the controversy sit, unanswered and unresolved, while it devoted resources elsewhere. That selective silence speaks volumes about institutional priorities. The viral video became a Rorschach test for how people view the WNBA. What you believed Griner said depended partly on what you were predisposed to believe about the league's culture. If you already suspected favoritism, the video seemed like proof. If you trusted the league's fairness, you assumed there must be a reasonable explanation being withheld. But the real issue isn't what the video shows, it's how the league responded to it. Consider the timeline. The video circulated widely. Reactions flooded social media. Players and fans debated what was actually said. Days passed. Weeks passed. No official investigation was launched. No statement was released by the WNBA explaining what happened or clarifying Griner's actual words. Nothing. Meanwhile, as we'll see, the league was investigating completely different allegations with remarkable speed and thoroughness. That contrast is what eventually caught Governor Braun's attention. It's not just about one video or one controversial moment. It's about the pattern of responses and what those patterns reveal about who gets protected and who doesn't. The viral video became the piece of evidence that made everything else the league had done seem suspect. Because if they'll investigate something that never happened while ignoring something caught on camera, what does that tell you about their commitment to fairness? The video also matters because it humanizes the conflict. People could actually see Griner in the moment, hear the emotion, and form their own conclusions. There was no hiding behind official statements or carefully worded denials. It was raw, unfiltered, and visible to millions. That visibility made the league's inaction even more conspicuous. You can't claim a thorough investigation process when you won't even acknowledge footage that everyone can see. What this first moment really reveals is that the WNBA had a choice. They could have immediately addressed the video, offered clarity, and moved forward. Instead, they chose to ignore it, downplay it, and hope it would fade from public memory. That choice, and the reasoning behind it, is what eventually drew political attention and sparked Governor Braun's intervention. The viral video wasn't the scandal. The league's response to it was. Now let's look at how the WNBA responded when allegations came about Angel Reese and racist remarks from Indiana Fever fans. This is where the contrast becomes impossible to ignore. After a game where the Chicago Sky got badly beaten by the Fever, we're talking a 30-point blowout. Allegations surfaced claiming that Fever fans had shouted racial slurs at Reese and other Sky players. These weren't things caught on video. These weren't recorded moments. These were accusations made after the fact, interpreted through emotion and potential bias. The WNBA's response was immediate and thorough. The league launched an investigation. They devoted resources to looking into these allegations. They took them seriously. They treated them as credible enough to warrant official action. And here's the kicker. After conducting their investigation, they determined the allegations were false. The fans in question had not shouted racial slurs. The accusations didn't hold up under scrutiny. The investigation essentially proved that what had been alleged didn't actually happen. Let that sink in for a moment. The WNBA investigated allegations that turned out to be completely unfounded. They spent time, money, and institutional credibility looking into something that never occurred. They were willing to investigate accusations despite having no video evidence, no recording, nothing concrete, just claims made after an emotionally charged game. And they moved quickly to do it, showing that when they want to investigate something, they have the capacity and speed to do so. But here's where the institutional bias becomes visible. While the league was rapidly investigating these unproven allegations, they were simultaneously ignoring Griner's video. One set of allegations, unverified and ultimately false, got the full investigative treatment. Another set of evidence, recorded and visible to millions, got silence. The resource allocation tells you everything about priorities. The Reese investigation also reveals something important about how narratives form in professional sports. After a devastating loss, especially one involving racial tension or perceived disrespect, emotions run high. Claims get made. Stories circulate. The league's job should be to investigate fairly and determine what actually happened. They did investigate the Reese allegations. They determined they were baseless. But their willingness to investigate at all, their speed in doing so, contrasts sharply with their handling of the Griner video. What makes this even more interesting is the fallout. The investigation cleared the Fever fans of wrongdoing. It proved the allegations false. So what happened next? Did the WNBA issue a public statement exonerating the fans? Did they apologize to the Indiana fan base for investigating claims that turned out to be fabrications? Did they acknowledge that resources were spent on false allegations? The answer is largely no. The investigation happened quietly, the results were accepted, and then silence again. This silence is particularly notable because of who it affects. Fever fans, Caitlin Clark's fan base, Indiana's basketball community, had been accused of racism. Even though those accusations were disproven, the damage to reputation lingers. People remember the allegations more than the exoneration. Yet the WNBA didn't feel obligated to publicly clear these fans or apologize for investigating unfounded claims. They just moved on. Compare that to how the league has handled other controversies. When allegations surface, even unproven ones, the league investigates and the results are broadcast. When video evidence exists, the league doesn't investigate and doesn't comment. The inconsistency is glaring, and it suggests that investigations happen when they serve certain purposes and don't happen when they might expose inconvenient truths. The Reese investigation also becomes a lens through which to view the broader WNBA culture. What does it say about a league that will rapidly investigate unverified allegations against fans, but won't investigate recorded comments by players? What does it suggest about where the league's loyalties lie? The speed of the Reese investigation proves the WNBA has the institutional machinery to act quickly when they choose to. So the delay and silence regarding Griner's video wasn't about capacity, it was about choice. Governor Braun noticed this too. He publicly questioned why, if the league investigated allegations about fans, they wouldn't also investigate recorded comments by a player. He wasn't being unreasonable. He was pointing out a logical inconsistency in how the league applies its standards. If fairness is the goal, then the same investigative rigor should apply to both situations. But it didn't, and that's what sparked his intervention. The Reese investigation also matters because it shows what happens when the WNBA decides something is important enough to investigate. They move fast, they're thorough, they reach conclusions, they prove they can operate with speed and decisiveness. So when they don't do those things for other situations, it's not because they lack the capability. It's because they lack the motivation or the willingness to pursue certain lines of inquiry. That's the real scandal. To understand why this controversy matters beyond basketball, you need to understand what Caitlin Clark has done for the WNBA. She's not just another young player breaking into the league. She's a generational talent who has transformed women's basketball at every level she's played. During her college career at Iowa, she sold out arenas. She brought national attention to women's college basketball in ways that previous players hadn't managed. Schools that had never drawn large crowds suddenly saw packed houses when Iowa came to town. Networks suddenly cared about women's basketball because Caitlin Clark was playing. When she entered the WNBA draft, expectations were enormous. The Indiana Fever selected her first overall, and what happened next surprised even optimistic observers. Games that would normally draw modest crowds suddenly sold out. Television ratings for Fever games spiked. The Gainbridge Fieldhouse, which previously hosted Fever games to partially filled stands, became a must-see destination. Every time Clark played, the arena was packed. Fans weren't just showing up, they were investing emotionally and financially in women's basketball in a way they hadn't before. The economic impact has been substantial. Ticket sales increased. Merchandise flew off the shelves. Local businesses benefited from increased foot traffic and spending on game days. Hotels filled up with visiting fans coming to watch Clark play. The Fever became relevant in Indiana in a way the team hadn't been in years. Governor Braun mentioned this specifically. Clark has brought unprecedented attention and economic benefit to the state. That's not hyperbole. That's measurable reality. But economic impact and popularity also create tension within competitive environments. Some players and observers have suggested that the focus on Clark represents a threat to other players or to the league's internal dynamics. When one player generates so much attention, media coverage, and fan interest, it inevitably means less attention goes to others. That's not necessarily unfair. It's just how popularity works. But it can breed resentment, especially among players who have worked equally hard and feel overlooked. There's also a narrative element at play. Clark represents something different. She's young, successful, confident, and she carries the attention of an entire state and growing national fan base. Some narratives in sports media have suggested that she's a threat to certain elements of WNBA culture, or that her popularity comes at the expense of other players. These narratives exist whether they're justified or not, and they create an atmosphere where some people might feel motivated to diminish her or cast her in a negative light. The Caitlin Clark factor also matters because she's white, which adds another layer of complexity to how controversies are framed and discussed. In professional sports, especially in basketball, race is often an undertone in debates about treatment and fairness. Some have suggested that Clark receives different treatment, either favorably or unfavorably, because of her race. These conversations are delicate and necessary, but they also create opportunities for people to project their own biases onto situations. What's undeniable is that Clark's presence has changed the WNBA. Attendance is up. Viewership is up. Conversation about women's basketball is constant. For a league that has struggled for decades to gain national attention, that should be celebrated. Instead, some reactions have been mixed or even hostile. That tension provides important context for understanding why the Griner video and the subsequent controversies have become so significant. Governor Braun's involvement in this situation is directly tied to Clark's impact on Indiana. He's not just defending a player, he's defending an economic asset that's benefited his state. He's also defending the dignity of fans who have invested in supporting women's basketball, only to have allegations made against them that turned out to be false. From his perspective, Clark and her fans deserve the same respect and fair treatment that other players receive. The Clark factor also explains why some people feel protective of her success and why others might feel threatened by it. She's generating interest in women's basketball at levels the league hasn't seen in its history. That should create opportunities for all players and the league as a whole. But if some people view her success as diminishing their own status or opportunities, it can create resentment rather than celebration. What's clear is that Caitlin Clark's arrival in the WNBA has exposed existing tensions and power dynamics within the league that were always there but now visible. Her success has shown a light on who benefits from the system and who doesn't. It's revealed who gets protected and who doesn't. And it's shown that when a player becomes too successful, too popular, or too much of an asset to the league, it can sometimes trigger defensiveness rather than support from other stakeholders. Governor Braun recognized that Clark represents not just basketball success, but also a broader opportunity for the WNBA. Rather than allowing tensions and controversies to undermine that opportunity, he decided to speak publicly about fairness and equal treatment. That intervention wouldn't have happened if Clark was just another player. It happened because her success matters to Indiana, to the WNBA, and to the future of women's basketball. Governor Braun didn't enter this situation lightly. He's a politician, which means he's aware of the risks of getting involved in cultural controversies. Yet he decided the situation required his voice. That decision tells you something important about how significant this controversy had become and how it was being perceived in Indiana. Braun's core argument was straightforward. If the WNBA investigated allegations against fans and determined those allegations were false, then the fans deserved an apology and public exoneration. Additionally, he argued that Brittney Griner, if she had made controversial remarks about Caitlin Clark, should face the same investigative standards and potential consequences that other alleged misconduct would face. In other words, he was calling for equal treatment and consistent application of league standards. When Braun stated that he believed Griner should apologize to Indiana and the fan base, he wasn't making an outlandish demand. He was asking for something basic: accountability and respect for people who had been accused of something they didn't do. The false allegations had damaged the reputation of Fever fans. Clearing them was important, but a public acknowledgement of that clearance and an apology for investigating baseless claims would have been the right institutional response. Braun also pointed out that Caitlin Clark herself hadn't publicly defended her fans or called for their exoneration. The team hadn't made a strong statement backing its own supporters. For a player and organization that claimed to stand for justice and equality, that silence felt hypocritical to some observers. If you're going to position yourself as someone who stands against false accusations and discrimination, you should be equally vocal when your own fans are falsely accused. The governor's intervention also carried significant weight because of his position and his constituents' investment in this situation. Voting Hoosiers care about Indiana basketball. They care about Caitlin Clark's success because it reflects well on their state. They care about fair treatment because fairness matters. When a governor speaks about these issues, he's speaking on behalf of people who elected him and who care deeply about what he's saying. What made Braun's involvement particularly significant was that he wasn't making this about politics. He was making it about basic principles of fairness and consistent treatment. He pointed out that what the WNBA was doing, investigating some allegations thoroughly while ignoring others, contradicted the values they claim to represent. That's not a political argument. That's an institutional integrity argument. Braun also emphasized what Caitlin Clark has meant to basketball in Indiana. He talked about how she's inspired young players, brought attention to the state, and created economic opportunity. He was essentially saying that the WNBA should recognize and protect that value rather than creating controversies that undermine it. That's not unreasonable. That's recognizing reality and asking an institution to act in accordance with their own interests. The governor's specific statements were measured and reasonable. He wasn't making wild accusations. He wasn't attacking the WNBA or women's basketball. He was asking for consistency and fairness. He was asking for apologies where they were owed. He was asking for the same investigative standards to apply to all situations. Those are basic institutional requests, not political grandstanding. What's particularly important about Braun's intervention is that it shifted the conversation from internal WNBA politics to external accountability. Previously, if complaints about league bias existed, they were discussed among players, fans, and media. The WNBA could largely control that narrative by issuing statements or ignoring criticism. But when a governor, an elected official representing millions of people, speaks publicly about institutional bias, it becomes something different. It becomes a matter of public interest and political concern. Braun's involvement also signaled to other politicians and institutions that this situation merited attention. If a state's governor is concerned about fairness in how his state's most prominent athlete is being treated, other political figures might feel emboldened to speak up too. Indeed, Indiana Senator Jim Banks also called for the WNBA to apologize to Fever fans, amplifying the message that institutional fairness was being questioned. The governor also made an interesting point about the economic and cultural dimensions of this situation. He noted that Caitlin Clark has essentially put Indiana on the basketball map in ways that previous athletes hadn't. She's created jobs, brought attention, and built pride in the state. For the WNBA to undermine that or allow controversies to damage, it seems counterproductive. From a practical standpoint, you protect and support the people and players who are making your league more valuable and visible. What Braun's intervention really did was legitimize concerns that had been floating around among fans and observers. If a governor thinks there's institutional bias in the WNBA, maybe those concerns deserve serious consideration. If an elected official believes the league isn't applying consistent standards, perhaps there really is a problem worth examining. His involvement gave credibility to the criticisms and forced the WNBA to take the situation more seriously than they might have otherwise. When you step back and look at how the WNBA has handled different controversies, a pattern emerges that's difficult to ignore. It's not about one incident or one questionable decision. It's about a consistent pattern of differential treatment that suggests some players and situations receive different scrutiny than others. Let's map this out. First, there's the Griner video, recorded evidence of controversial comments caught on camera for millions to see. The league's response, relative silence and inaction, no official investigation, no public statement, no clarification. The matter was essentially treated as something to be avoided rather than addressed. The league had clear video evidence, yet chose not to engage with it formally. Then there are the Reese allegations. Unverified claims made after an emotional game, no video evidence, no recording. The league's response: rapid investigation, deployment of resources, thorough examination of claims, clear determination that allegations were false. The league moved decisively and thoroughly, treating unproven allegations with the seriousness normally reserved for documented misconduct. Third, consider how the WNBA has treated various comments directed at or about Caitlin Clark. Some observers have noted that critical remarks about Clark's play, her performance, or her impact are frequently scrutinized heavily, with discussions about whether they cross lines. Meanwhile, remarks made by other players seem to receive less attention or different treatment. The scrutiny isn't evenly distributed. Fourth, look at how the league handles criticism from players with particular status versus newer players. Long-established players with strong media relationships and cultural presence seem to face less institutional pressure when controversies arise. Newer players or those without that same institutional protection face different standards of accountability. That's institutional bias operating in real time. The pattern also includes how the league handles requests for investigation or accountability. When Governor Braun asked why the league didn't investigate Griner's comments with the same rigor they'd applied to the Reese allegations, the implication was clear. The league chooses which situations merit investigation based on factors other than the severity or clarity of evidence. If there's video evidence of problematic comments, you'd expect investigation. If there's unverified allegations with no evidence, investigation seems less automatic. But the WNBA did the opposite. This pattern suggests that investigations happen when they serve certain purposes or protect certain interests, while investigations don't happen when they might expose uncomfortable truths or create problems for favored players or narratives. That's institutional bias in its purest form, not necessarily malicious, but systemic and consistent. The bias pattern also extends to how different players' comments are interpreted and discussed. The same types of comments might be interpreted charitably when made by certain players and harshly when made by others. One player's trash talk is seen as competitive spirit and character. Another player's similar comments are seen as problematic or crossing lines. The interpretation depends partly on who's making the comment and what institutional relationships exist. There's also a pattern in how the league responds to external criticism. When politicians or commentators outside the WNBA question the league's fairness, the league tends to either ignore the criticism or respond defensively. They rarely engage substantively with the charge that their decision-making reflects bias. That defensive posture itself suggests institutional awareness that something might be off. The pattern becomes clearer when you look at resource allocation. The league invested significant resources into investigating false allegations against fans. Yet when there's a recorded video of a player's comments, those resources don't get deployed with similar urgency. That's not about capacity. The Reese investigation proved the league can move fast. It's about priorities, and priorities reveal values and biases. What's particularly revealing is that this pattern existed before Governor Braun spoke up. Fans, observers, and media critics had noticed the differential treatment for some time. Some players and their supporters had felt the bias. The governor's intervention didn't create the pattern. It simply forced public acknowledgement of something that was already operating beneath the surface. The bias pattern also extends to how different players' mistakes are handled publicly. Some players' errors in judgment are treated as learning moments or character-building experiences. Other players face more severe public criticism for similar missteps. That differential response tells you something about who the institution prioritizes protecting and who they feel comfortable allowing to face public scrutiny. Consider also how the league frames different situations in their official communications. When the narrative supports certain players or protects certain interests, communications are clear and detailed. When the situation might expose bias or unfairness, communications are vague or absent. The quality and clarity of league communication varies based on what's being communicated and whose interests are being served. This pattern of differential treatment suggests that the WNBA has inadvertently created a tiered system where some players operate with more protection and less scrutiny, while others face greater accountability and less institutional support. That's not fair. That's not equal. That's institutional bias operating within a structure designed to appear neutral. The real problem isn't that bias exists. Some degree of preference and favoritism exists in virtually every institution. The problem is that the WNBA has been inconsistent in how it applies its standards, which reveals that bias. Governor Braun and others didn't invent this pattern. They simply pointed it out and asked why it exists. When an institution's investigative procedures become visibly biased, something fundamental breaks. It's not just about this one controversy anymore. It's about whether anyone can trust the institution to be fair and consistent. That's what the WNBA is facing right now, a credibility crisis that goes beyond Brittney Griner or Caitlin Clark. Credibility in institutional decision-making is built slowly and destroyed quickly. The WNBA's credibility was built on claims of fairness, professionalism, and commitment to player welfare and justice. Over decades, the league claimed it was creating a space where women could compete at the highest level with equal respect and equal treatment. Those are fundamental institutional values. But credibility only exists if your actions match your stated values. If you investigate some situations thoroughly while ignoring others, if you protect some players while leaving others exposed, if you move fast on unverified allegations while staying silent on recorded evidence, your stated values become meaningless. People stop trusting that you're actually committed to what you claim to be committed to. The credibility crisis is particularly damaging for the WNBA because the league operates in a competitive sports landscape where trust matters. Players need to believe that league decisions are fair and that they'll be treated consistently. Fans need to believe that the league has integrity and isn't playing favorites. Sponsors need to believe that their association with the league reflects well on their brand. When credibility cracks, all of those relationships become strained. What makes this credibility crisis especially acute is that it involves differential treatment based on power and status. If bias operated randomly or affected everyone equally, you might explain it away as incompetence or bad luck. But when bias clearly advantages some players while disadvantaging others, it suggests intentional favoritism. And intentional bias is harder to forgive or overlook than systemic incompetence. The credibility crisis also affects how league decisions are perceived going forward. If the WNBA makes a decision about discipline or investigation or interpretation of rules, people will now question whether that decision reflects what actually happened or whether it reflects what the league wants to have happened. That's poison for institutional trust. Every future decision becomes suspect. Consider what happens to player trust when bias becomes visible. Players who benefit from bias feel they can continue getting favorable treatment. That creates entitlement and expectations of special treatment. Players who don't benefit from bias feel they're not being treated fairly, which creates resentment and anger. Neither situation is healthy for league culture. Visible bias corrupts the environment for everyone. The credibility crisis also affects sponsorships and media relationships. Companies that sponsor the WNBA want to be associated with a league that stands for integrity and fairness. When that integrity becomes questionable, sponsors have to ask themselves whether they want their brand linked to an institution that appears to operate unfairly. Media outlets covering the WNBA have to grapple with whether they're covering a fair competition or a system rigged by institutional favoritism. What's particularly damaging is that the credibility crisis reveals that league leadership either doesn't recognize the bias or doesn't care about it. Either option is problematic. If decision-makers don't see the bias, it raises questions about their competence. If they see it but don't care, it raises questions about their values. Neither scenario inspires confidence in the institution. The governor's intervention made the credibility crisis impossible to ignore. Previously, concerns about bias could be dismissed as complaints from disappointed players or fans. But when an elected official representing millions of people says the league has a credibility problem, that becomes a public matter. The credibility crisis shifts from internal gossip to external perception, which is much harder to control or minimize. Rebuilding credibility after this kind of damage requires clear action. It requires the WNBA to acknowledge that bias existed, explain why it happened, commit to specific changes, and then demonstrate through consistent behavior that the changes are real. That's a long process, and there's no guarantee that rebuilding efforts will be successful. Trust, once broken, is difficult to restore. The credibility crisis also affects recruitment and retention of players. Young players looking at the WNBA as a career option now have to consider whether the league will treat them fairly based on merit or whether institutional favoritism will determine their experience. That's a significant factor in whether talented athletes choose to play in the WNBA or pursue other opportunities. What's unfortunate is that the WNBA's credibility crisis is largely self-inflicted. If the league had simply applied consistent standards to all situations, investigating the Reese allegations with rigor and investigating the Griner situation with the same rigor, this entire controversy might have been avoided. Instead, differential treatment created the perception and reality of bias, which shattered credibility. The credibility crisis also reveals something about how institutions handle pressure and criticism. Rather than engaging transparently with concerns about fairness, the WNBA seemed to hope the controversy would disappear. That approach worked until Governor Braun spoke up. Now the league faces a credibility crisis that won't go away through silence or avoidance. They'll have to address it directly or risk further damage. Real accountability means different things in different contexts, but fundamentally it means facing consequences for actions and decisions. When an institution operates with bias, accountability requires acknowledging that bias, explaining how it happened, and committing to change. For the WNBA, those accountability questions are now impossible to avoid. The first accountability question is straightforward. Did the WNBA apply different investigative standards to different situations? The evidence suggests they did. They investigated unverified allegations about fans quickly and thoroughly. They didn't investigate recorded comments by a player with similar urgency. If they did apply different standards, why? Was it intentional? Was it systemic? Was it based on particular institutional relationships? These aren't speculative questions anymore. They're legitimate accountability questions that demand answers. The second accountability question involves the investigation results. The WNBA determined that allegations against Fever fans were false. Those fans had been accused of serious misconduct and cleared. Did the league feel responsible for having investigated false allegations? Should they have issued a public apology or statement acknowledging that the investigation found nothing? What did they do to clear the names of people who'd been accused of something they didn't do? That's basic institutional accountability. Third, who decided which controversies warranted investigation and which didn't? Was this decision made by individuals, committees, or institutional policy? Was there a clear process, or was it based on judgment calls? If it was judgment calls, what factors influenced those judgments? Were decisions made based on the severity of evidence or based on other considerations? Accountability requires understanding the decision-making process. There's also the question of what Brittney Griner actually said and what responsibility she should bear for controversial comments. If she made inappropriate remarks, what consequences should follow? If she made comments that were misinterpreted, what clarification should she provide? If she remains silent while the situation generates controversy, what does that silence mean for her as a person and a player? These are accountability questions that haven't been adequately addressed. The accountability questions also extend to league leadership. Who made decisions about how to handle the Reese allegations? Who decided not to investigate or comment on the Griner video? What conversations happened about differential treatment? Did anyone raise concerns about bias or inconsistency during decision-making? Were there dissenting views that didn't make it into the final decisions? Accountability requires understanding who did what and when. Another accountability question involves whether the WNBA's stated values, fairness, justice, equality, are genuine commitments or just marketing language. When an institution's actions contradict its stated values, it raises questions about whether those values are real or just for show. The WNBA talks about supporting players and standing against injustice, but their handling of these controversies suggests those values might not be as central as claimed. The accountability questions also include whether the league's institutional culture enables bias. Do certain players have better access to decision makers? Do certain players have agents or representatives with strong league relationships? Are decisions made through formal processes or through informal relationships? If informal relationships matter more than formal processes, that's a structural accountability issue that needs to be addressed. There's also the question of external accountability. The WNBA is a professional league operating in public space with public audiences. They have some obligation to the public to operate fairly and transparently. When Governor Braun and others raise fairness concerns, should the WNBA respond publicly and substantively? What accountability do they bear to elected officials and the constituents they represent? These are questions about institutional responsibility beyond just internal league matters. The accountability questions become more complex when you consider that some decisions may have been made with good intentions, but resulted in bias anyway. Maybe the WNBA didn't intentionally decide to treat Griner differently. Maybe institutional cultures and informal relationships just happen to result in different treatment. Institutional bias can operate without conscious intentionality, but that doesn't absolve the league of accountability. It just means accountability requires addressing systemic issues, not just individual decisions. Real accountability would probably include several things: a transparent review of how the league made decisions about these controversies, public acknowledgement of where differential treatment occurred, apologies to those who were unfairly treated or subjected to unverified allegations, clear commitment to future consistency in how similar situations are handled, and potentially structural changes to decision-making processes to prevent bias. Whether the WNBA will actually take these accountability steps is unclear. Some institutions respond to external pressure by making real changes. Others resist or make superficial adjustments while continuing to operate the same way. The WNBA's response will tell us something important about how seriously they take their stated values and how genuinely they're committed to fairness. The accountability questions also matter for players like Brittney Griner. Even if she made comments that were misinterpreted or taken out of context, sitting silently while others defend her or explain her position isn't accountability. True accountability would involve addressing the situation directly, either clarifying what she said or acknowledging that her comments were inappropriate. Silence combined with differential league treatment makes her look like she's being protected rather than held to the same standards as other players. This controversy about the WNBA, Brittney Griner, and Caitlin Clark is ultimately about something bigger than basketball. It's about the credibility and future of women's professional sports in America. What gets decided in how the WNBA handles this situation will matter for years to come. The WNBA has spent decades fighting for legitimacy, investment, and attention in a sports landscape dominated by men's basketball and football. That fight has been difficult, and progress has been slow. The arrival of Caitlin Clark represented a genuine turning point, a moment when the league could finally capitalize on increased interest and investment. Instead, controversies and perceived bias have threatened to undermine that moment. What's at stake is whether women's professional basketball will be perceived as a serious, fairly operated institution or as something that operates through favoritism and bias. That perception matters for recruitment, sponsorship, viewership, and the overall cultural status of the league. If the WNBA is seen as biased and unfair, talented women will question whether they want to play there. Sponsors will question whether they want to associate with it. Fans will question whether they want to invest time and money in following a league with credibility problems. There's also what's at stake for future players facing controversies. If the WNBA has established a precedent of investigating some incidents thoroughly while ignoring others, that precedent will affect how future controversies are handled. Players will know that how they're treated depends partly on their status and relationships within the league. That's not healthy for a competitive professional environment. What's at stake for Caitlin Clark is her experience as a player and whether she feels valued and protected by the league she's helping to elevate. She's brought unprecedented attention to the WNBA. If the league responds by allowing controversy and bias to swirl around her, that sends a message about how they value their most valuable asset. That affects her career satisfaction, her commitment to the league, and potentially her longevity as a WNBA player. There's what's at stake for Indiana and for states across America that have invested in women's sports. Governor Braun's involvement signals that state governments are paying attention to how their constituents are treated and whether their athletes are being treated fairly. If the WNBA continues to operate with bias, expect more governmental pressure and external scrutiny. That's not something the league can easily control or dismiss. What's at stake is the credibility of women's athletics more broadly. The WNBA doesn't exist in isolation. It's part of a broader ecosystem of women's sports at the college and professional level. If the WNBA is seen as operating unfairly, it affects perceptions of women's sports more broadly. Parents and young athletes will consider whether they want to invest time and energy in sports where institutional fairness is questionable. There's also what's at stake for sports journalism and media coverage. If the WNBA operates with bias, journalists covering the league have a responsibility to investigate and report on that bias. But if the league is successful in suppressing coverage or minimizing criticism, that reflects poorly on sports media. The public discussion of this controversy in Governor Braun's intervention shows that some issues are too significant for media to ignore, even if they might prefer to. What's at stake is whether professional women's sports can achieve the legitimacy and investment they deserve. The WNBA has been fighting for decades just to get basic respect and resources. Caitlin Clark's arrival was supposed to be the breakthrough moment. If that moment gets undermined by institutional bias, it sets back the entire movement toward gender equity in professional sports. That's not just about basketball. It's about whether women's sports will ever be treated as equal to men's sports. There's what's at stake for Brittney Griner herself. Her legacy is significant. She's one of the most accomplished players in WNBA history. But if this controversy ends with her being perceived as a player who is protected by league bias rather than held to the same standards as others, that affects how she's remembered and how her accomplishments are viewed. Real accountability and transparent handling of the situation would be better for her legacy than silence and apparent favoritism. What's at stake is the message the WNBA sends about whose complaints matter and whose don't. If fans' complaints about unfair treatment are investigated thoroughly, but players' complaints about bias are ignored, the league is saying that institutional priorities are misaligned with stated values. That message affects everything else the league does and says. There's what's at stake for institutional reform and change. If the WNBA successfully navigates this controversy by making minimal changes and hoping people forget about it, they'll have learned that external pressure doesn't require real institutional change. But if they decide to meaningfully reform their decision-making processes and commit to consistency, that sets a precedent for how institutions should respond to bias concerns. What's at stake is whether America's female basketball fans will continue to invest their time, money, and emotional energy in the WNBA. Fans are customers. If they feel disrespected or if they lose faith in the integrity of what they're watching, they'll invest elsewhere. That's not a threat. It's just how consumer behavior works. The WNBA's long-term sustainability depends on maintaining fan investment. Finally, what's at stake is a fundamental question about institutional fairness. How institutions respond to concerns about bias reveals their true values and priorities. The WNBA's response to this controversy will tell us whether they're genuinely committed to fairness and equality, or whether those are just nice-sounding concepts they've built their brand around. The answer to that question will matter for the next decade of women's professional basketball. This entire situation reveals a fundamental contradiction at the heart of the WNBA. The league claims to stand for fairness, justice, and equal treatment. Yet, when faced with a situation requiring consistent application of those principles, they apply different standards to different situations. That contradiction between stated values and actual behavior is what created this crisis. Governor Braun didn't invent a problem that didn't exist. He simply pointed out something visible to anyone paying attention. The WNBA investigates some allegations thoroughly while ignoring others caught on video. They protect some players while leaving others exposed to intense scrutiny. They claim to stand for justice while operating systems that reveal bias. The real scandal isn't what Brittney Griner may or may not have said. The scandal is that the league's investigative processes appear designed to protect certain interests rather than pursue fairness. The scandal is that credibility has been compromised by visible bias. The scandal is that an institution claiming to advance women's sports has created a system where some women, and some fans, matter more than others. The question now is whether the WNBA will take this as a wake-up call and commit to genuine institutional reform, or whether they'll wait for the controversy to fade and continue operating the same way, banking on people forgetting about this moment. Whatever they choose will reveal what they actually value. What do you think they'll do? Share your thoughts below, and subscribe for more analysis of sports controversies that go deeper than the headlines.